There's a man standing in a kitchen at 40 years old, keys already in his hand, half out the door, already late for something that felt like it mattered. He doesn't know yet that in 30 years he'll remember this exact moment. Not because anything happened in it, but because nothing did. No conversation, no lingering, no looking up from the counter to really see the people standing there. If you could walk into that kitchen right now, if you could stand behind that man for just 10 seconds before he leaves, what is the one thing you would need him to hear? Not later, not when it's convenient. Right now, before the door closes. Stay with me because by the end of this, you're going to find out exactly what that sentence is and why it took 40 more years to understand it. Today isn't a list of regrets. It's something more useful than that. It's the conversation you'd have with your younger self if he would actually sit still long enough to listen. 8 things. 8 truths that don't fully make sense until you've lived long enough to test them against real life. Against loss, against quiet houses, against mornings where nobody needs anything from you at all. Some of these will sting a little. That's fine. The sting means it's true. By the time we get to the end, you'll understand exactly what that man in the kitchen needed to hear, and maybe, more importantly, what you still have time to say to someone else. Reason number 1 starts small enough that you might miss it if you weren't looking directly at it, and yet it shapes almost everything else on this list. You built your whole 40s around being useful. The fixer of things, the one who remembered the appointments, the one whose absence would actually be noticed at the dinner table. And somewhere in that decade, without ever choosing it out loud, you started measuring how loved you were by how needed you were. Nobody sits you down at 25 and explains the difference. Nobody says, this is love, and this exhausting, admirable, relentless usefulness is something else entirely. So they get tangled together early, and by 40 they're basically the same wire in your head. You keep the household running. You solve the problems before anyone else notices them. You show up early and leave last. And every time somebody says, I don't know what we'd do without you, some old part of you exhales because it sounds like love, and it feels close enough to love that you stop checking for the real thing underneath it. Here's what nobody tells you until much later. Being needed is conditional. It depends on circumstances, on children being young enough to require you, on a job requiring your particular skill, on a body strong enough to carry the weight everyone else set down. Being loved isn't supposed to be conditional at all. And the terrifying part of getting older is watching the conditions disappear one by one. The job ends, the kids don't call for advice anymore, your hands aren't the ones people reach for first, and discovering, in that emptiness, whether what's left standing is actually love, or whether it was only ever usefulness wearing love's coat. This didn't start at 40 either. It started decades earlier, in a household where love was demonstrated through doing rather than said out loud, where a full refrigerator meant more than the words, I love you, ever did, and where showing up for chores and responsibilities was the only vocabulary anyone in the family had for affection. By the time you reached your 40s, that vocabulary had become so automatic you couldn't have named it as a choice. Felt like simply who you were. There's a simple test that only becomes available later in life, and it's this: love is what remains when usefulness is removed entirely. Watch who stays when you can no longer fix anything, arrange anything, provide anything at all. Who sits with you anyway, who calls with nothing to ask for, who simply wants to be near you and not near what you can do. That's the evidence you were looking for all along. It was just never findable at 40, because at 40, nothing had been taken away yet to reveal it. For a lot of people, that discovery arrives like a small, quiet earthquake. Not dramatic. Just a Tuesday where nobody needs anything from you, and the silence in the house asks a question you were too busy to ask yourself for 40 years. If you weren't useful today, would anyone have still wanted you here? That's not insecurity you carry. That's a story about worth you were handed before you ever agreed to it. And once you start noticing that story, you start noticing how many other things you believed at 40 were never actually true either, starting with the thing that ran your entire calendar. The truth, once you sit with it long enough, is almost relieving. Love was never supposed to be earned through exhaustion. It was there underneath the usefulness the whole time, waiting for you to stop performing long enough to notice it. But that raises a harder question. If being needed wasn't the point, what was all that urgency actually for? That question about urgency deserves an honest answer, because reason number 2 is the one most people recognize instantly, and wince a little doing it. How many of your 40s were spent responding to something that felt like it couldn't wait? The email, the deadline, the meeting that got moved up. Do you remember what any of it actually was? Most people can't. That's not a failure of memory. It's a clue. The urgent things at 40 had a particular quality. They announced themselves loudly. They came with consequences attached. They made your chest tighten if you looked at them too long. So naturally, you gave them your best hours, your clearest thinking, your undivided attention. Meanwhile, the actually important things. A daughter standing in the doorway wanting to talk. A spouse who'd stopped mentioning how tired they looked. Your own body sending small signals you filed under later. Those things never announced themselves at all. They just waited. Quietly. Patiently. The way important things do because they trust you'll eventually turn toward them. Here's the mechanism nobody explains. Urgency hijacks attention because it's wired to your nervous system's oldest alarm, the one built for actual danger, not quarterly reports. Importance, on the other hand, has to be chosen. Nothing forces you to notice it. No deadline attached to telling your son you're proud of him. No alarm bell when your wife needed 10 minutes of just being looked at instead of managed. So the calendar filled itself with noise, and the quiet things, the ones that would have mattered in 20 years, kept getting pushed to a later that had no actual date on it. You weren't careless. You were responding exactly the way you were built to respond, in a culture that rewards the loud and ignores the slow. But looking back now, the arithmetic is almost unbearable. Decades of energy spent on things you can't name anymore, borrowed from a much smaller pile of moments that would have actually stayed with you. There's a physical cost to this too, one that has nothing to do with any specific diagnosis. Simply the accumulated weight of decades spent responding to false alarms. A body that's rarely allowed to settle doesn't know the difference between an actual crisis and an inbox. It treats both the same way, and over enough years, that constant low hum of alertness becomes the only setting you know, until quiet itself starts to feel unfamiliar, even unsettling instead of restful. It isn't too late to reverse the ratio either. The calendar that once filled itself with noise can just as easily be filled, on purpose, with the quiet things you postponed. A phone call with no agenda, an afternoon with no deadline attached to it. Importance never stopped waiting. It simply started waiting somewhere you finally have time to look. That's not a personal failing. That's a system that never once asked how you were doing, and you answered it anyway. And once you see how urgency stole your attention from importance, you start to wonder about all the other things you thought you had time for, including the people you assumed would just always be there. Importance doesn't shout, and it never will. That's not a flaw in the world. It's a test, one most of us don't pass until we're old enough to finally hear the quiet. Stay with me, because the next one is the one almost everyone says they'd change if they could go back. That regret shows up most clearly in reason number 3, and if you raise children, you already know exactly what this feels like. Picture the phone that used to ring every day, then every few days, then only on holidays. Picture setting the table for 4 out of habit, before remembering it's just the 2 of you now. That silence isn't punishment. It just feels like it. At 40, you were still the center of your children's orbit. The answer to their questions, the fixer of their scraped knees and broken hearts, the person whose approval quietly organized their choices. It's easy, in that season, to mistake being central for being essential forever. So when they grow up and start making decisions without consulting you, choosing a job you'd have advised against, moving across the country, going quiet about things they used to tell you everything about, it can feel in your body before your mind catches up like a kind of abandonment. But raising a child well was never supposed to end in them needing you the same amount forever. That was the whole design. A parent's job, if it's done with any real love, works itself out of a role, trades being needed for being trusted, trades daily involvement for something quieter and, honestly, more mature. A grown person choosing freely to keep you in their life not because they have to, but because of who you were to them. Nobody warns you how much that transition hurts, even when it's going exactly right. The ache isn't a sign something went wrong. It's the cost of having loved someone enough to raise them into a person who doesn't need you the same way anymore. And if you're honest, isn't that closer to the point than you gave it credit for at the time? You didn't raise a child to keep them. You raised them to release them, and grief and pride were always going to arrive in the same breath. And there's a particular kind of pride available here too, one that takes longer to access than the grief does. The pride of watching someone you shaped make a life you didn't design for them on their own terms, and realizing that was always the actual goal even when it didn't feel like one at the time. That's not losing him. That's what loving him well was always going to look like eventually. But letting go of a child is one kind of loss. There's another kind almost nobody prepares you for, and it usually shows up around the same time. The quiet after they leave isn't empty. It's just unfamiliar. A room that used to be full of noise now holding something steadier, if you let it. That unfamiliar quiet often circles back to something harder. Reason number 4, the one that tends to hit hardest late at night. You worked because you believed that was love. Long hours, missed dinners, a paycheck instead of a bedtime story. In your mind, that was the sacrifice a good provider made, and you made it without complaint. Nobody in your generation was taught that presence and provision could ever compete with each other. You were taught that a man or a woman working just as hard in a different kind of exhaustion proved love through what they provided. The roof, the tuition, the security nobody in the house ever had to think about because you were quietly, constantly thinking about it for them. That felt like the whole job. And in many real ways, it was a form of devotion. Nobody should pretend otherwise. But there's a version of you now, decades later, who remembers birthdays you worked through and games you missed for meetings that, if you're honest, could have waited. And that version of you carries a specific quiet grief, not because you failed to love your family, but because you're only now able to see that love had more than one currency, and you spent almost everything you had in just one of them. This isn't about blame. You couldn't have known then what only time would teach you, that a child doesn't remember the mortgage being paid on time nearly as vividly as they remember whether you showed up to the recital. That your presence, unglamorous and unremarkable as it felt in the moment, was actually the rarer gift, precisely because it cost you something urgency never did. Your attention, freely given, with nothing to show for it afterward except a memory only they would carry. This is also, quietly, the reason grandchildren land so differently than children once did, because by the time they arrive, you finally understand which currency actually mattered, and you spend it without hesitation the second time around, as if some part of you has been waiting years for another chance. Your children, for what it's worth, likely forgave you for this a long time ago. Children are usually more generous toward their parents than parents are toward themselves. The unfinished business isn't between you and them anymore, in most cases. It's between you and the version of yourself who still can't quite accept that forgiveness, who keeps replaying the missed recital instead of hearing the grown adult in front of you say, sincerely, that it's all right. You gave what you believed love required. It just turns out love required something you didn't know you were allowed to give, your time, unearned and unexplained, simply because you wanted to be there. That's not selfishness catching up with you. That's a good man discovering love had a second half he never got to spend. If you're carrying that particular ache right now, you're not alone in it, and the next one might explain why your own body has been trying to tell you something for years. You cannot go back and sit in that gym seat you missed, but you can still choose today which currency you spend the rest of your time in, and that choice is not too late. It never was. Take a breath with me for a second, because what comes next is about your body, and it deserves your full attention. Your body, it turns out, was never actually silent about any of this. Reason number 5 is about learning late how to listen to it. How many times did you push through a headache that was really exhaustion? How many times did you call the tightness in your chest stress? And keep moving anyway? Because stopping wasn't on the schedule. At 40, the body still forgives quickly. You could run on 4 hours of sleep and a pot of coffee and mostly get away with it. Not because you were being wise, but because you hadn't yet spent enough years withdrawing from an account you assumed was bottomless. So you learned, without meaning to, that discomfort was something to override, not something to hear. Tired wasn't information. It was an obstacle between you and the next task. What almost nobody tells you at that age is that the body doesn't actually stay quiet. It just changes how loudly it has to speak to get your attention. First it whispers. A little fatigue, a stiffness that wasn't there before, sleep that doesn't quite restore you the way it used to. If those whispers keep getting ignored, because ignoring them worked for 20 years, the body eventually has to raise its voice. And by the time it's shouting, it isn't really trying to punish you. It's trying to finish a conversation it's been attempting to have with you since you were 41. This isn't about fear, and it isn't about blame for choices made without the information you have now. It's about a simple, almost tender realization. The body was never the enemy standing between you and your responsibilities. It was one of the most honest voices in your life, and for a long time it was also the one you were most willing to talk over. Listening now looks different than it would have at 40. Smaller adjustments, gentler pacing, permission to rest without needing to justify it to anyone, including yourself. None of that undoes the years of overriding. But every year you spend listening from here forward is a year the old pattern doesn't get to have. That's not weakness you're remembering. That's a body that was trying to tell you something long before it had to shout. You're still here, which tells me something about you, and it means you're ready for the part of this list that's less about what you did wrong, and more about what quietly slipped away without you noticing. Listening to your body now doesn't undo the years you spent overriding it. But it does mean the conversation isn't over, and it's one you finally get to have on your own terms. If you're still here, this next part matters even more, because it's about the people who quietly disappeared from your life, not through any single fight, but through nothing happening at all. That disappearing act is exactly what reason number 6 is about, and it rarely announces itself the way an argument would. Think of a friend you used to talk to every week, whose voice you could probably still hear clearly in your memory, and then try to remember the actual day you stopped talking. You probably can't. There wasn't one. Friendships in your 20s and 30s survive on proximity almost by accident. You're at the same jobs, the same parks with your kids, the same neighborhoods, and the friendship maintains itself without either of you doing much work at all. Nobody warns you that this changes completely by your 40s, when careers pull people in different directions, kids grow up and stop being an excuse to see each other, and the effort a friendship requires suddenly has to be chosen on purpose, out of a calendar that no longer has any spare room in it. Most friendships don't end in a fight. They end in 100 small postponements. A call you meant to return, a lunch that kept getting rescheduled, a version of "we should catch up soon" that both of you said and neither of you meant as a real plan. And because nothing dramatic ever happened, there's no clear moment to grieve, no closure to point to. Just an absence that grows so gradually you don't register it as loss until you're 65 and realize you have acquaintances instead of friends, and it happens so slowly nobody's even to blame. The hardest part of this particular truth is that it was preventable, in a way some of the others on this list weren't. A body ages regardless of what you do, but a friendship needed one phone call a month, one lunch a season, one small act of choosing someone even when it wasn't convenient, and that possibility was there the entire time, quietly waiting for you to take it. Distance made this easier to justify, too. A friend who moves 3 states away doesn't feel like a friend you're choosing to lose. It feels like circumstance, like something that happened to the friendship rather than something either of you did. But circumstance was never actually the obstacle. Phones existed the entire time. What was missing wasn't opportunity. It was the small, repeated decision to use it for something other than logistics. There's also a quieter shame tangled up in this one. The assumption that reaching out first, after so much silence, would look desperate or strange. But most people on the other end of that silence are hoping for the exact same phone call, too proud or too unsure to be the one who makes it first. That's not betrayal on anyone's part. That's what happens when nobody has time to notice a silence growing. And if that ache is landing right now, stay with me a little longer, because what's coming next might be the truest thing on this whole list. It's not too late to make one of those calls. The friendship you assumed was gone might just be waiting for the same thing you were waiting for, somebody to go first. We're close to the heart of this now. Stay with me for what comes next. There's an old proverb that says, "The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now." Sit with that for a moment, because everything on this list, the love you mistook for usefulness, the urgency that stole years from importance, the children you had to release, the presents you traded for provision, the body you overrode, the friends you let drift, all of it points to the same 20 years ago tree you can't go back and plant. That part is true, and pretending otherwise would be a kind of lie this channel refuses to tell you. But the second half of that proverb is just as true, and it's the half most people forget the moment grief shows up. Today is still available. The tree you didn't plant at 40 can still go into the ground now, with roots that grow slower, maybe, but no less real. That's exactly where reason number 7 lies. In the difference between the certainty you were chasing at 40 and the peace that only arrived once you let it go. At 40, you believed you were supposed to have it figured out by now. The plan, the answers, the version of yourself that finally felt finished. That belief wasn't random. It came from every direction at once. A culture obsessed with having your life together. A career that rewarded decisiveness over honesty. A role as parent or spouse that seemed to demand you always know what to do next. So you performed certainty even when you didn't feel it, because uncertainty at 40 looked, from the outside, a lot like failure. You made the confident choice in the meeting. You gave the reassuring answer at the dinner table. You kept your doubts private, because private doubts felt safer than a public admission that you, too, were still figuring this whole thing out. What almost nobody tells a 40-year-old is that certainty was never actually the goal. It was a costume worn by people who hadn't yet lived long enough to trust themselves without it. The peace that comes later, if you're fortunate enough to find it, doesn't come from finally having all the answers. It comes from the opposite, from realizing you can hold a question without needing to resolve it immediately, that "I don't know yet" is not the same as "I am lost," and that some of the wisest people you'll ever meet are the ones who stopped pretending decades ago. It's worth noticing, too, who you actually trust more now, the person who claims to have every answer, or the person who says, "I'm honestly not sure, but here's what I've noticed." Most people, once they're honest, trust the second one more. Somewhere along the way, without ever announcing it, you started becoming that second person yourself. It takes a strange kind of courage to say, "I don't know" out loud, especially after a lifetime spent being the one others look to for answers. Can feel, at first, like admitting defeat. But watch what actually happens when you say it honestly without apology. Most people don't lose respect for you. They lean in closer, relieved that they're allowed to not know things too. There's a particular kind of relief that only shows up once you stop performing certainty for an audience that, honestly, was never watching as closely as you feared. It doesn't arrive at 40. For most people, it doesn't arrive until much later, until enough of life has happened that you finally understand not knowing was never the emergency you built your whole personality around avoiding. That's not confusion catching up with you late in life. That's honesty finally being allowed to speak. And once you stop needing to have it all figured out, something else becomes possible, including finally making peace with the very person you were hardest on, back when certainty felt like the whole job. Not knowing, it turns out, was never the failure you feared it was. It was just honesty, arriving a little later than the culture ever gave you permission to let it. That permission to be honest leads directly to reason number 8, the last one, and for many people the hardest one to actually accept. If the man you were at 40 walked into this room right now, tired, overworked, doing his best with information he didn't have yet, would you be able to look at him without judgment? Most people, when they picture their younger self, picture someone to critique. You'd tell him to slow down. You'd tell him to call his friends back, to sit in the recital instead of checking his phone, to say the thing to his wife instead of assuming she already knew. And all of that is fair. Every reason on this list is, in its own way, a case against the choices that version of you made. But here's what 40 years of distance can finally let you see. If you let it, that man wasn't careless. He wasn't cruel. He was doing exactly what he'd been taught love and responsibility looked like, with the tools he had at the time, under pressures you can see clearly now and couldn't see it all then. He got the urgency and the importance backwards, not because he didn't care, but because nobody ever taught him the difference. He mistook being needed for being loved because nobody sat him down and explained the difference. He wasn't failing. He was 40, doing the best he knew how to do with what he had. It helps, sometimes, to imagine what you'd say to a friend who came to you carrying this same list of regrets about their own 40s. You wouldn't recite the list back to them as evidence against their character. You'd tell them they were human, that hindsight is the cruelest teacher because it only shows up after the test is over, and that the fact they're asking these questions at all says something good about who they've become. You deserve to hear that same sentence from yourself. Judging him from here, with everything you've since learned, isn't wisdom. It's just unfairness dressed up as hindsight. The real wisdom, the kind this whole list has been circling since the beginning, is being able to look at that tired man in the kitchen with keys in his hand and say, quietly, without irony, "You did the best you could with what you knew." That sentence isn't letting him off the hook. It's finally putting the hook down. Forgiving him doesn't erase what it cost the people around him. But refusing to forgive him doesn't give any of that back either. It just adds one more casualty to the list, and that casualty would be you, spending whatever years remain still punishing a man who can't hear you anymore, except that he can, because he is you. That's not weakness. Forgiving him. That's the truth, finally catching up to both of you at the same time. And that man in the kitchen, the one you met at the very beginning of this, he's still waiting for you to finish that sentence. Every one of these 8 things points to the same quiet truth. You didn't waste your 40s. You survived them the only way you knew how, and now, finally, you know a little more. So let's go back to that kitchen. The man is still standing there, keys in hand, half out the door, already late for something that felt, at the time, like the most important thing in the world. You know now what he didn't. You know that being needed isn't the same as being loved. You know that urgency lied to him about what mattered. You know he'll release his children well, if he lets himself. You know his presence would have meant more than his paycheck ever could. You know his body was already trying to talk to him. You know the friends drifting away were worth one more phone call. You know certainty was never the point. And you know, more than anything, that he deserves to be forgiven for not knowing any of this yet. So if you could stand behind him for those 10 seconds before the door closes, here's the sentence. You're doing better than you think you are, and you have more time than you believe. Say that to him, and then say it to yourself right now because it's still true. If this found you at the right moment, consider staying a little longer with this channel. Elderly Light isn't going anywhere, and neither really are you. There's more of this waiting whenever you're ready to hear it. Subscribe if you'd like to keep this conversation going, not because you have to, but because some conversations are worth continuing.